What happens when a man who measures life in stock prices and steel towers laughs at his wife's simple life one last time? For Ethan Hayes, a titan of industry, this divorce was just another business deal, the clean removal of a non-performing asset. He saw his wife Clara as a gentle, naive artist he needed to set aside to make way for a life that matched his ambition. In a glass-walled conference room, he offered her crumbs from his empire, a final act of condescending charity. But he never thought to ask about the small, forgotten investment she made with her heart years ago. An investment that was about to turn his world and his billion-dollar net worth completely upside down. The silence in their Atherton, California mansion was a physical entity. It was a cold, polished thing, much like the marble floors and the floor-to-ceiling glass walls that offered a panoramic yet emotionally distant view of the San Francisco Bay. For Ethan Hayes, founder and CEO of the tech behemoth InnovateX, this silence was the sound of success. It was the absence of distraction, the hum of a well-oiled machine. For his wife Clara Bennett, it was the sound of suffocation. Ethan stood by the window, not admiring the sunset, but checking the closing numbers of the NASDAQ on his phone. His reflection was a sharp, tailored silhouette against the bleeding orange sky, a man sculpted by ambition and billion-dollar valuations. He hadn't really looked at Clara in months, maybe years. He saw her, of course, in the way one sees a familiar piece of expensive art in their own home. She was beautiful, graceful, but static. Clara was in her studio, a sun-drenched annex he'd had built for her as a lavish birthday gift 5 years ago. It was the only room in the house that felt alive. It smelled of turpentine and linseed oil, of damp clay and fresh canvas. Her hands, stained with cerulean blue and burnt sienna, were molding a small, intricate sculpture of a bird with a broken wing. Her art was her language, and for years it had been screaming into the void of their marriage. Her pieces were about connection, about nature's quiet resilience, about the beauty and imperfection, all concepts that had become alien in Ethan's world of ruthless efficiency and perpetual upgrades. Clara. Ethan's voice cut through the quiet of her studio. He didn't enter, just stood at the threshold, his expensive Italian leather shoes refusing to cross into her world of creative chaos. "We need to talk." She didn't look up immediately, her fingers gently smoothing a clay feather. "I'm listening, Ethan. I've been speaking with my legal team." He said it like he was announcing a new product launch. "I think it's time we formalized our separation. A divorce. It's the most logical step." The clay bird crumbled in her hands. She finally looked up, her soft brown eyes, which once held a universe of admiration for him, were now just weary. "Logical," she repeated, her voice a fragile whisper. "Is that what this is? A logic problem?" Ethan sighed, a gesture of profound impatience. "Clara, please. Let's not be dramatic. We haven't been partners for a long time. I live in my world, you live in this one." He gestured vaguely at her paintings, her sculptures. To him it was a hobby, a quaint distraction. "My life is accelerating. InnovateX is about to close the biggest acquisition in its history. I need alignment, synergy. Sophia understands that." Sophia Vance. The name hung in the air, sharp and metallic. Sophia was his COO, a woman as sleek and polished as the glass tower they worked in. She spoke in quarterly reports and wore ambition like a second skin. Clara had seen the way Ethan looked at Sophia during company galas, like she was the next market to be conquered. "So this is about Sophia," Clara said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "It's about the future," he corrected, his tone dismissive. "It's about not being held back by things that no longer fit. I'm prepared to be very generous, of course. I'll set you up in a nice condo, a trust fund. You'll be comfortable. You won't have to worry about anything." The condescension was the sharpest cut of all. He wasn't just leaving her. He was retiring her like an old piece of hardware. He saw her as simple. A painter. A gentle soul who couldn't possibly comprehend the complexities of the world he navigated. He saw her as a liability to be managed, a problem to be solved with money. She stood up, wiping her clay-dusted hands on her apron. "I see," she said, her composure a shield he couldn't penetrate. "Then have your lawyers send my lawyer the paperwork. I'll be staying with my sister in Portland for a while." He nodded, relieved at her lack of hysterics. "Good. That's sensible." He turned to leave, his duty done. "Ethan," she called out, her voice stopping him at the door. He turned back, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. "Yes? Do you remember what you told me on our third date at that little cafe in North Beach?" He frowned, searching his memory archives and coming up empty. "No, I don't. You said," Clara continued, her eyes locking onto his, "that my simplicity was like a compass, that it always pointed true north and it would keep you from getting lost in the noise." For a single fleeting moment, a crack appeared in his polished facade. A memory of a younger man full of dreams that weren't yet measured in stock options. Then the mask was back in place. He gave a short, humorless laugh. "We were kids, Clara. People change. Compasses break." He walked away, leaving her alone in the only room in the house that had ever felt like a home. She looked down at the crushed clay in her hands, the broken-winged bird. But as a single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek, it wasn't a tear of defeat. It was a tear of release. He thought he was leaving her with nothing, but he had no idea she was the one who had been holding the map all along. The drive to Portland felt like an exhale Clara had been holding for a decade. The sterile, manicured landscapes of Silicon Valley gave way to the misty, untamed greens of the Pacific Northwest. It was a journey back to herself. Her sister Amelia welcomed her with a hug that felt more real than any touch she'd received from Ethan in years, and a simple question, "Are you okay?" "I will be," Clara answered, and for the first time she believed it. In the quiet of Amelia's guest room, surrounded by old photographs and the scent of rain, the past came rushing back. She remembered the Ethan Hayes she had fallen in love with. He wasn't a titan then. He was a brilliant, scruffy coder with eyes that lit up when he talked about changing the world, not owning it. They had met in a shared workspace in San Francisco. He was building the first iteration of Innovate X in a cramped cubicle fueled by cheap coffee and revolutionary ideas. She was a freelance artist painting murals for local businesses, her hands always smudged with color. He had been drawn to her quiet intensity, her different way of seeing the world. "You see the code in everything," she'd told him once, looking at one of his complex algorithms. "I see the poetry." He loved that about her. He'd called her his true north. When venture capitalists were pressuring him to compromise his vision, he'd come home to her, and she'd talk him back from the ledge, not with business advice, but with simple human truths. "Is it making the world better or just noisier?" she would ask. That question became his mantra. The first 5 years of their marriage were a whirlwind of success. InnovateX exploded. Their small apartment became a starter home, then a larger one, and finally the Atherton Glass Palace. With every upgrade, a small piece of the old Ethan seemed to get deleted. The man who once loved long, aimless walks in Golden Gate Park became a man who only measured distance in the time it took his private driver to get from his mansion to his private jet. Sophia Vance arrived like the final software update that overwrites the original operating system. She was sharp, Ivy League educated, and utterly ruthless. She spoke Ethan's new language of acquisitions, leveraged buyouts, and market disruption. Clara would watch them at dinner parties, a tag team of corporate power finishing each other's sentences about synergy and shareholder value. They didn't just work together, they vibed on a frequency Clara couldn't and didn't want to access. The shift was subtle at first. Ethan started missing their anniversary dinner for an emergency board meeting in Hong Kong, which Clara later saw from a financial news photo included Sophia. He started scoffing at her artist friends, calling them unrealistic. The final deepest cut was when he dismissed her art itself. She had spent a year on a collection for a gallery show, a series of paintings about the unseen connections between people and nature. She was proud, vulnerable, and excited to show him. He walked through the gallery on opening night, his phone buzzing incessantly. He glanced at the canvases, a polite, vacant smile on his face. "It's very nice, honey." He'd set his eyes already on a text message. The colors are pleasant. Did you see our Q3 projections? We're up 18%. He hadn't seen a single thing she was trying to say. He saw pleasant colors, where she had poured her soul. That was the night she knew her husband was gone, replaced by the CEO. The man who once saw her as his compass now saw her as a quaint, decorative object from a past he had outgrown. The love hadn't died in a fiery explosion. It had been starved of oxygen in a sterile, climate-controlled mansion. It had been rendered obsolete. The divorce proceedings were exactly as cold and transactional as Ethan had intended. His lawyer was a man named Julian Croft, a notorious shark in the Silicon Valley legal world known for dismantling spouses' claims with surgical precision. Clara hired a quiet older gentleman from Portland, a man named Robert Davies, who had been a friend of her father's. Ethan had openly laughed when his team did a background check on him. A family law attorney from Portland, he'd boomed to Sophia over drinks. She's bringing a butter knife to a gunfight. It's almost sad. The first offer came via a sterile email from Croft's office. It was on the surface generous for a simple housewife. A lump sum of $5 million, the deed to a luxury two-bedroom condo in Sausalito, and a monthly alimony of $50,000 for 5 years. The total package was worth around $10 million. To a normal person, it was a fortune. But in the context of Ethan Hayes' estimated net worth of $4.7 billion, it was less than a rounding error. It was the financial equivalent of a pat on the head and a run along now. The offer came with a thick stack of non-disclosure agreements and a clause that required Clara to waive any and all future claims on InnovateX stock or any of Ethan's other assets. Mr. Davies read the terms over the phone to Clara, his voice calm and steady. "It is an offer made from a position of profound arrogance, Clara," he said. "He believes you are ignorant and will be intimidated." "I am not ignorant, Robert," she replied softly. "And I'm not intimidated." Their first mediation session was held in a soulless conference room in San Francisco. Ethan was there, flanked by Julian Croft and 2 junior lawyers who looked like they were cast from a legal drama. Sophia Vance sat slightly behind Ethan, not officially part of the proceedings, but her presence was a clear statement of power. She was the future. Clara was the past being settled. Clara walked in with only Mr. Davies. She wore a simple navy blue dress, her hair tied back. She looked composed, calm, and entirely out of place amidst the sharp suits and predatory energy. Ethan didn't meet her eyes. He addressed Mr. Davies with a practiced air of magnanimity. "Mr. Davies, I want to make this as painless as possible for Clara. The offer on the table is more than fair. It ensures she'll live in comfort for the rest of her life. She won't have to worry about a thing." Julian Croft slid a folder across the vast mahogany table. "Our forensic accountants have confirmed that Ms. Bennett has no direct claim to any pre-IPO InnovateX shares. The company was founded prior to the marriage, and all assets were placed in an ironclad trust. The offer we have made is pure goodwill on Mr. Hayes' part." Mr. Davies opened the folder but didn't look at it. He looked at Clara, who gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "We find the offer to be insufficient," Mr. Davies said politely. Ethan scoffed. "Insufficient, a $10 million package for a woman who hasn't worked a day in her life since we married. What exactly does she think she's entitled to?" The contempt was naked now, the pretense of goodwill stripped away. "My client's contributions to this marriage were not financial," Mr. Davies countered smoothly. Sophia leaned forward and whispered something in Ethan's ear. He smirked. "Ah, yes, emotional support," Ethan sneered. "I'm sorry, but that doesn't have a line item on a balance sheet. Look, Clara," he said, finally looking at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and annoyance. "I know numbers and finance aren't your strong suit. That's fine. That's what I have people for. But you need to be realistic. Take the deal. It's the best you're going to get. It's a golden parachute for a life you no longer have to participate in." He was so sure of himself, so blinded by her quiet demeanor. He saw her silence as weakness. He saw her simple dress as a sign of her simplicity. He saw her Portland lawyer as a confirmation of her naivete. Every single assumption he made was a brick in the wall of his own hubris. Clara finally spoke, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the tension in the room. "The offer is not acceptable, Ethan." "Then you're a fool." He snapped, his patience gone. "You're going to drag this out and walk away with less. Don't say I didn't warn you." Mr. Davies calmly closed the folder. "We will be presenting our own financial disclosures at the final hearing. We believe they will recontextualize the discussion." Julian Croft laughed out loud. "Recontextualize? What are you going to disclose?" "The market value of her paintings." "Sir, we are not playing games here." "I assure you, Mr. Croft," Mr. Davies said, a glint in his eye, "neither are we." They left the room, leaving Ethan's team smug and victorious. "She's bluffing," Ethan said to Sophia, shaking his head. "She has nothing." He laughed, a short, sharp sound of absolute certainty. "She's just too simple to know when she's beaten." The story of Clara's secret was rooted not in Silicon Valley's aggressive ambition, but in the quiet wisdom of her grandmother, Eleanor. Eleanor had been a botanist, a woman who believed that the most resilient things grew slowly, often unnoticed. When she passed away, she left Clara a modest inheritance of $50,000. It came with a handwritten note. "Invest this not with your head, my dear, but with your heart. Find something that helps things grow." This was 8 years ago. Ethan was already a rising star, and $50,000 to him was a rounding error on a dinner bill. He'd suggested she buy a designer watch or invested in a blue-chip stock he recommended. "It's the smart play, Clara. Safe returns." But she remembered her grandmother's words. Instead of calling Ethan's broker, she spent weeks exploring small fledgling companies. She wasn't looking at profit margins or 5-year growth projections. She was looking for a mission she believed in. She found it at a small tech fair in San Jose, tucked away in a corner far from the flashy displays of giants like InnovateX. It was a 2-person startup called Verdant Echo. Their founder was a young, earnest idealist named Leo Sharma. His vision wasn't about disruption or market capture. It was about connection. Verdant Echo was a platform designed to connect local artisans, farmers, and small creators directly with their communities, cutting out the corporate middlemen. It used sophisticated technology not to alienate but to foster genuine human interaction. It was an app that helped you find the old man who made honey in his backyard, the woman who wove blankets from local wool, the farmer who grew the sweetest peaches you'd ever tasted. It was, in a word, simple. Clara listened to Leo talk for an hour. He spoke with a passion she hadn't seen in Ethan for years. He talked about strengthening community roots and using tech to remember, not just to forget. Ethan would have laughed him out of the room. He would have called it a niche charity project with no scalable model. But Clara saw the poetry in the code. She saw her grandmother's garden. It was something that helped things grow. She approached Leo after his presentation. "I'd like to invest," she said. Leo was stunned. They had been seeking seed funding for months and had been rejected by every venture capital firm in the valley. "Ma'am, we're very high risk." "I understand," she said. "My grandmother told me to invest with my heart." She wrote him a check for the entire $50,000, her entire inheritance. It gave her a 25% equity stake in the fledgling company. When she told Ethan about it, he was bemused, even condescending. "Verdant Echo. What is that, a gardening app?" he chuckled. "Honey, you just threw that money away. But hey, it's your money. Consider it a donation to a good cause." He forgot about it the next day. But Clara didn't. She didn't meddle, but she followed their progress quietly. She was their first believer. Her investment wasn't just money, it was validation. It allowed Leo to hire a small team and refine the platform. For years, Verdant Echo grew slowly, organically under the radar. It built a fiercely loyal user base in Portland, then Seattle, then across the country. It turned out people were hungry for connection, for authenticity. In a world of sterile, globalized e-commerce, Verdant Echo was a breath of fresh local air. It didn't make explosive headlines. It just worked, weaving itself into the fabric of communities. The tipping point came 2 years ago. A major global pandemic shut down the world, fracturing supply chains and isolating people. Suddenly, local connection wasn't a quaint ideal. It was a vital necessity. Verdant Echo's platform became a lifeline. Usage skyrocketed. Small businesses that would have been decimated were able to survive and even thrive by connecting with their neighbors through the app. The giants of Silicon Valley who had ignored them for years suddenly took notice. This niche charity project had tapped into a fundamental human need they had overlooked in their quest for global domination. 6 months before Ethan had asked for a divorce, a bidding war for Verdant Echo began. Google, Amazon, and even a subsidiary of Facebook were at the table. Leo, staying true to the company's ethos, was careful. He wanted a partner who wouldn't gut the company's mission. 3 weeks ago, while Clara was packing her bags to leave for Portland, the deal was finalized. Verdant Echo was being acquired by Salesforce for its community-building technology and its fiercely loyal user base. The deal was structured to allow the company to operate with a large degree of autonomy, preserving its core mission. The acquisition price was $4.8 billion. Clara Bennett, the quiet artist. The simple wife who didn't understand numbers, still owned 25% of the company. Her initial $50,000 investment, the one her husband had laughed at, was now worth $1.2 billion. Her lawyer, Robert Davies, had all the documentation. He had the initial investment agreement, the stock certificates, and the final executed acquisition papers from Salesforce's top legal team. As she sat in her sister's quiet home, Clara felt a strange sense of calm. The money was staggering, yes, but it was the vindication that truly mattered. Ethan had measured her worth and found it wanting. He had assessed her simplicity as a flaw. But it was that very simplicity, her ability to see value in human connection and quiet growth, in a heartfelt idea, that had yielded a fortune beyond his wildest calculations. He thought he was playing chess while she was painting. He never realized she was playing an entirely different game on a board he couldn't even see. The day of the final hearing was overcast, the San Francisco sky a uniform depressive gray. The mood inside the conference room of Croft, Hayes and Associates was just as somber, but laced with a smug electric tension. Ethan's team was ready for a swift execution. Ethan sat at the head of the table, looking every bit the conquering king. He wore a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than Clara's car. Beside him, Sophia Vance was a vision of corporate perfection in a sharp black dress. Her presence was a calculated power move, a clear signal that the transition was already complete. Clara entered with Robert Davies, projecting the same quiet calm she had throughout the ordeal. Today her simple dress was a shade of deep forest green. It was a subtle nod to Verdant Echo, a private joke that only she understood. "Let's get this over with." Julian Croft began, his voice booming with confidence. "We are here to sign the final dissolution agreement. My client has graciously decided to stand by his original generous offer despite Ms. Bennett's ill-advised reluctance. The papers are here for your signature, Clara." He slid the leather-bound document across the table. It landed in front of her with a soft thud. Clara didn't look at it. She looked at Ethan. For a moment she allowed herself to see the man he used to be, the brilliant dreamer in the worn-out sweater. A pang of genuine sadness hit her. Not for herself, but for him. For everything he had lost, and didn't even know it. Mr. Davies cleared his throat. "Before my client signs anything, as we stated, we have our own financial disclosures to present." Croft rolled his eyes. "Mr. Davies, we have been over this. Unless your client has a winning lottery ticket in her pocket, this is a waste of everyone's time." The junior lawyers snickered. Ethan leaned back in his chair, a bored, indulgent smile on his face. This was the final act of a tiresome play, and he was ready for the curtain to fall. "I understand your skepticism," Mr. Davies said, his voice impeccably mild. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a slim navy blue folder. It was a stark contrast to the thick, intimidating binder from Ethan's team. "However, the law requires full financial disclosure from both parties prior to dissolution. We are simply complying." He opened the folder and slid a single sheet of paper across the table to Julian Croft. It was a summary of assets. Croft picked it up, glanced at it, and his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He read it again, his confident smirk faltering. He looked up at Mr. Davies, then at Clara, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. He discreetly slid the paper over to Ethan. Ethan picked it up, annoyed at the interruption. He read the first line, "Assets of Clara M. Bennett." He skimmed down past a few minor entries, a personal checking account, a 401k from her freelance days. Then he saw the line item that made the world stop. Shares in Verdant Echo Inc., 25% equity stake. Initial investment $50,000. He remembered, vaguely, the gardening app, the donation. He almost laughed again, ready to mock her for listing a failed startup as an asset. But it was the next line that vaporized the air in his lungs. Valuation post-acquisition by Salesforce Inc., executed August 18, 2025. Net personal value. One done, $200, $1,000. Ethan stared at the number. $1.2 billion. The zeros seemed to blur to mock him. It didn't compute. It was like seeing a unicorn trot through the conference room. It was an impossibility, a glitch in the matrix of his perfectly ordered world. He looked across the table at Clara, his ex-wife, the simple artist. He was waiting for her to break, to gloat, to show some sign that this was a prank. But her expression was serene, unchanged. The silence in the room stretched, becoming thick and heavy. Ethan's team was frozen, staring at their boss, whose face had gone from tan to a pale, sickly white. It was then that Ethan, in a final desperate act of cognitive dissonance, did the one thing that would forever seal his fate in this story. He laughed. It wasn't a real laugh. It was a strained, choked, incredulous sound, a noise of pure disbelief. $1 billion, he sputtered, shaking his head. Verdant Echo. That little hobby project? This is a joke. This has to be a joke. He looked at Clara, his eyes pleading for it to be a lie, for the world to make sense again. And with a voice full of a pity she no longer felt she owed him, he delivered the final insult. "Come on, Clara. You don't even know how to balance a checkbook. How could you possibly—" He trailed off, the absurdity of his own words finally hitting him. He had spent a decade underestimating her. He had mocked her values, dismissed her intelligence, and patronized her very existence. And all along, her simplicity, her focus on human-centric value, the very thing he'd discarded, had been quietly building an empire that dwarfed his own recent gains. The sound of Ethan's disbelieving laughter died, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. It was the sound of a world tilting on its axis. Julian Croft, the shark, was the first to recover. His professional instincts took over even as his mind reeled. He snatched the paper back, his eyes scanning it for a loophole, a mistake, a typo. "This is unsubstantiated," he stammered, his voice lacking its earlier authority. "I can assure you it is fully substantiated." Robert Davies replied, his calm demeanor now feeling less like meekness and more like immense power. He reached into his briefcase again and produced a second, slightly thicker folder. This contains the signed and executed acquisition agreement from Salesforce's M&A division, the wire transfer confirmations from the escrow agent, and a certified statement of net worth for my client prepared by Goldman Sachs. He didn't slide the folder. He placed it deliberately in the center of the table. It sat there like a time bomb. Sophia Vance, who had been watching the scene with a detached amusement, was now bolt upright in her chair. Her perfectly calculated mask of indifference shattered. Her eyes darted from Ethan's ashen face to the quiet woman across the table. Her entire future was tied to Ethan's power, his status, his wealth. She had aligned herself with who she thought was the most powerful person in any room. In an instant, that calculation had become catastrophically wrong. The woman she had dismissed as a relic was now by a staggering margin the wealthiest person at the table. Ethan finally tore his eyes away from the paper and looked at Clara. It was as if he was seeing her for the first time. The quiet artist, the gentle wife, the woman he had deemed too simple for his world. He was looking at a billionaire. A self-made billionaire who had beaten him at his own game without even trying to play it. His mind raced, trying to process the implications. The irony was suffocating. He, the visionary of InnovateX, the man who could spot a market trend from a mile away, had been completely blind to the billion-dollar opportunity that had been nurtured under his own roof. He had preached disruption while she had quietly funded a revolution of connection. All his talk of synergy and alignment was just noise. Her compass, the one he said was broken, had pointed directly to true north all along. "How?" Ethan whispered the word barely audible. It wasn't a legal question. It was existential. Clara met his gaze, and for the first time he saw not sadness or weakness in her eyes, but an unbreachable strength. There was no triumph, no "I told you so." There was something far more devastating: closure. "You taught me to look for scalable models, Ethan," she said, her voice even and clear. "You just measured scale in the wrong currency. You thought it was about users and data points. I invested in a model that scaled kindness, and it turned out to be quite valuable." Her simple words were a more profound indictment of his life's philosophy than any legal argument could ever be. He had built an empire of glass and code, but it was hollow. She had nurtured a garden, and it had yielded an impossible harvest. Julian Croft cleared his throat, his face grim. "Given this new information, we will obviously need to retract our previous offer." He looked at Mr. Davies. "What are your client's terms?" The entire room held its breath. This was the moment. She could have taken him for everything. She could have demanded half of InnovateX, the mansion, a piece of his soul. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had inverted with the force of a supernova. Mr. Davies looked at Clara. She gave another small nod. "My client," he announced, "has only one term. She will waive any and all claims to Mr. Hayes's assets, his properties, and his stake in InnovateX." Ethan stared dumbfounded. "What?" "In return," Mr. Davies continued, "Mr. Hayes will waive any and all claims to Ms. Bennett's assets. We are proposing a clean break. Each party leaves with what they themselves have built." He then slid a new, much simpler one-page document across the table. "This is a mutual waiver of all marital property claims. Sign it, and we are done." The magnanimity of the gesture was the final crushing blow. She didn't want his money. She didn't need it. Her generosity wasn't a calculated move. It was a statement of fact. His entire empire, the thing he had sacrificed his marriage and his soul for, was utterly irrelevant to her. She had already won. Ethan's hand trembled as he reached for the pen. His world had been built on a clear hierarchy of value, and he had always been at the top. Now he was a footnote in his ex-wife's story. The generous settlement he had offered her minutes ago was now a source of burning, profound humiliation. He was the one being offered charity, the charity of her indifference. He looked at Sophia. Her face was a carefully controlled mask, but he could see the frantic calculations behind her eyes. He was no longer the prize he had been an hour ago. Their shared future, built on the foundation of his supreme power and wealth, now rested on cracked and unstable ground. The synergy was gone, replaced by a new terrifying balance sheet. Without a word, Ethan uncapped the pen and signed the waiver. His signature, usually a bold, confident scrawl, was shaky and thin. He pushed the document back across the table. Clara took the document. Her movements were graceful and unhurried. She signed her name, Clara M. Bennett, with a steady hand. The ink was dark and final. She was no longer Clara Hayes. She had reclaimed not just her financial independence, but her very name. She stood up. Mr. Davies gathered their papers and placed them neatly into his briefcase. The battle was over. Clara looked at Ethan one last time. There was no anger in her eyes, no pity, not even sadness anymore. There was just a vast, quiet distance. She was a ship that had reached a new continent, looking back at a shore that had long since disappeared over the horizon. "Goodbye, Ethan," she said softly. And then she turned and walked out of the conference room. She didn't look back. Her footsteps were nearly silent on the plush carpet, but for Ethan, they echoed like cannon fire. Each step was taking her further away into a future he couldn't comprehend, built on a wisdom he had mocked. The door clicked shut, leaving an unnerving silence in its wake. Ethan Hayes, the tech titan, the master of the universe, was left sitting in the ruins of his own making. He was still a billionaire by any normal standard, but in that room at that moment, he had never felt so poor. He had laughed at her simplicity only to discover it was a language of value he had never learned to speak. And his ex-wife, the simple artist, had just walked away, the sole proprietor of a world he could now never hope to own. He had lost his compass long ago, and now finally he was truly irrevocably lost. The click of the conference room door shutting behind Clara was the quietest, most destructive sound Ethan Hayes had ever heard. It was the sound of his world being sealed shut. For a long moment, nobody in the room moved or spoke. The billion-dollar revelation had sucked all the oxygen out of the air. Julian Croft stared at the signed waiver on the table as if it were a strange alien artifact. His junior lawyers avoided looking at anyone, their faces a mixture of shock and terror. It was Sophia Vance who broke the spell. She stood up, her movements precise and controlled. There was no sympathy in her eyes as she looked at Ethan, only a cold, hard assessment. It was the same look she gave a company whose stock was in freefall. "Well," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a shard of glass. "That was unexpected." Ethan flinched as if struck. He looked at her, searching for an ally, a partner to share in his disbelief. He found none. He saw only a strategist reevaluating a compromised asset. "This is insane," Ethan finally managed to say, his voice raspy. "It's a fluke, a lottery ticket." "A lottery ticket she picked and you told her to throw away." Sophia countered, her tone dangerously calm. "This isn't a fluke, Ethan. It's a data point, a very significant one." Julian Croft finally found his voice. We should have done a more thorough asset search. I don't know how we missed this." "You missed it because I told you not to bother." Ethan snapped, rage finally beginning to boil up through the shock. "I told you she had nothing. She was a painter. She bought organic vegetables at the farmer's market." He was shouting now, his voice echoing in the acoustically perfect room. He was trying to reassert his reality, the one in which he was the visionary, and she was the simpleton. But the facts were immutable. The numbers on the page didn't care about his narrative. Her hobby just outperformed the last 5 years of your vision. Sophia said, her words clinical and brutal. She picked up her purse. "I have a Q4 planning call. We can talk later, Ethan, when you've had a chance to process." She didn't offer a comforting touch or a word of support. She offered him the same corporate brush-off he had given Clara 1,000 times. She walked out of the room, her heels clicking a sharp, decisive rhythm on the marble floor. She was already distancing herself, recalibrating. Their partnership was built on the premise of mutual ambition and ascending power. His power had just been publicly, humiliatingly checked. The drive back to the Atherton mansion was a blur. Ethan sat in the back of his Maybach, staring unseeingly at the blur of Silicon Valley passing by. The sleek headquarters of tech companies, monuments to logic and ambition, now seemed like foolish follies. News, especially news, this scandalous travels through the valley's elite circles with the speed of light. By the time he walked through the massive front door of his empty house, his phone was already buzzing with encrypted messages from board members. "Heard the settlement was surprising. Care to elaborate? Is there an exposure risk to Innovate X we should be aware of? Let's schedule a call to discuss optics." They weren't concerned for him. They were concerned for the company, for the stock price. He, the man, was inseparable from the brand, and the brand was now associated with the biggest miscalculation in recent history. The story was just too good, the tech genius who couldn't see the gold mine in his own house. It undermined the very myth he had built around himself, the myth of infallible foresight. He walked into Clara's old studio. The cleaning crew had been through, but a faint scent of turpentine still lingered. He had always hated the smell. Now it smelled like victory. On an easel in the corner sat a single forgotten painting she hadn't taken with her. It was a landscape, but an abstract one. A chaotic, vibrant forest floor with a single impossibly bright flower pushing its way through the dark soil toward a distant sun. He stared at it for a long time. For the first time, he didn't see pleasant colors. He saw the narrative. He saw the struggle, the resilience, the quiet, inexorable growth that happens in the dark far from the spotlight. It was the story of Verdant Echo. It was the story of Clara. He had been living with this prophecy for years and had been utterly blind to it. Weeks turned into a miserable month. His relationship with Sophia fractured completely. Their conversations became terse adversarial negotiations. She questioned his judgment in board meetings, subtly siding with other members who were beginning to doubt his leadership. The synergy they once had was exposed as a shared hunger for power, and now they were circling each other like wary predators. One evening, during a heated argument in his sterile living room, she laid it all bare. "I aligned myself with you because you were the apex predator, Ethan," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "You were decisive, ruthless, and you always won. But you just took the most devastating loss of your career, not to a competitor, but to the one person you deemed completely irrelevant. That isn't just a financial loss, it's a strategic one. It shows a blind spot, a fatal flaw, and I don't invest in assets with fatal flaws." It was the most painful thing anyone had ever said to him because it was true, and it was a logic he himself had taught her. She was breaking up with him as if he were a failing startup. He had been outcapitalized, and the terms of their merger no longer made sense. She left that night. Ethan was truly alone then, rattling around in a 20,000-square-foot monument to his own ego. The glass walls no longer felt like a symbol of transparency and success. They were the transparent walls of a cage, and everyone could see the diminished creature inside. He had traded his compass for a calculator, and it had left him a billionaire adrift in a sea of his own making, with no way to find true north. While Ethan's world was shrinking to the size of his own bitter solitude, Clara's was expanding limitlessly. She didn't buy a private jet or a fleet of supercars. She didn't appear on the cover of Forbes, though they called relentlessly. Her first major purchase after the money settled was a 100-acre plot of land on the Oregon coast, a wild, beautiful place where ancient forests met the sea. It came with a rambling century-old farmhouse, built of cedar and stone surrounded by overgrown gardens. She spent the first few months not in boardrooms, but on her knees in the dirt wearing old jeans and muddy boots. With the help of a few local gardeners, she began the slow, patient work of clearing the weeds and nurturing the soil back to health. She was restoring her grandmother's garden, but on a grander scale. This was her new headquarters. It smelled of salt spray and damp earth. Her second act was to establish a foundation. She called it the Eleanor Bennett Foundation, in honor of the woman whose wisdom had started it all. Its mission was simple and clear: to fund the unfundable, to provide the first crucial seed money to small visionary projects that, like Verdant Echo, prioritized community art and sustainable technology over explosive empty growth. Leo Sharma, who had remained a friend and confidant, agreed to sit on the board. "You're doing it again, Clara," he told her during their first meeting held on the farmhouse porch with coffee mugs in hand. "You're finding the things that are going to matter and giving them a chance to grow." The foundation became her art form. Instead of canvas and clay, her new medium was capital and trust. She and her small team sought out passionate people, a woman in Detroit developing an app to connect urban farmers with food deserts, a group of teachers in Appalachia creating a remote learning platform to preserve local folklore and crafts, an engineer in New Mexico designing low-cost solar-powered water purifiers for small communities. These were the people Ethan would have dismissed as niche charity projects. Clara saw them as the seeds of a better, more connected world. She didn't just give them money. She gave them mentorship and a network of support. She was building an ecosystem of kindness. Her own art flourished as never before. Her new studio was a converted barn with huge windows that looked out over the Pacific. The crushing silence of the Atherton mansion was replaced by the sound of crashing waves, wind in the trees, and the laughter of friends. She painted with a joy and freedom that had been dormant for years. Her work became bolder, more vibrant, infused with a profound sense of peace and power. One crisp autumn evening, about a year after the divorce, she was hosting a small gathering at the farmhouse. It was for the first cohort of creators funded by her foundation. The air was filled with the aroma of a home-cooked meal, the murmur of excited conversation, and the crackle of a bonfire under a canopy of stars. It was everything her old life was not: warm, genuine, and full of life. Her phone, lying forgotten on a table, buzzed. She glanced at the screen. It was a news alert. InnovateX CEO Ethan Hayes steps down amidst shareholder pressure and a failed hostile takeover bid. She read the headline. There was no surge of victory, no schadenfreude. There was nothing. It was like reading about a storm in a distant country she had left long ago. His world, his battles, his rise and his fall, it was all just noise. It had no power over her. She put the phone back down, screen side down, and turned her attention back to the fire. One of the artists was telling a story, and the whole group was captivated, their faces illuminated by the warm, dancing light. Clara smiled a genuine, easy smile. She was home. She hadn't just walked away from a marriage, she had walked back to herself. She had taken the simplicity he had laughed at and used it to build a world of staggering, immeasurable value, a garden of her own, finally in full bloom. Clara's story is a powerful reminder that simplicity is not weakness, and true wealth isn't always measured in dollars on a balance sheet. It's about integrity, vision, and the quiet courage to invest in what you truly believe in, even when the world tells you it's worthless. Ethan Hayes learned the hard way that the most valuable assets are the ones you can't quantify: empathy, connection, and the wisdom to see the forest for the trees. What did you think of Ethan's reaction when he finally learned the truth? Was Clara's final act of waving his money the ultimate power move? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you were moved by this story of quiet triumph and poetic justice, please don't forget to hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable real-life dramas. Thanks for listening.